And I have just re-put the accessibility copy into the chat. I also would like to urge you, if you do not already, to please follow ODSECS on Eventbrite or to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I'm going to pop those into the chat as well. Oh, it doesn't look like the links are going through, but that's okay. You can figure it out. Cutting and pasting is slow work. Okay. Anyway, we have a brilliant slate of speakers lined up for 2023, and we're kicking off today with Anna Schwartz, which I'm really excited about, and not just because I find the title of her paper unbelievably hilarious, which probably tells you a lot about my sense of humor. So in keeping with tradition, I'm about to cede the floor to Courtney Weiss-Smith, who is our introducer, who will be introducing Anna Schwartz. And I'm sure that Courtney needs no introduction to the great and good assembled here, but I'm going to do it anyway, because I think the world of Courtney, and singing her praises is a rare pleasure. She is an associate professor of English at Wesleyan University. She's also a brilliant editor, work that I think is undervalued in the profession, but is so important and is actually, one of the real pillars of scholarship and learning. And so I just kind of want to thank her for that fantastic work, and name check History and Theory, which she's associate editor for, and also the New Norton Anthologies Restoration in 18th Century volume, which I think is what, the 11th version now, is going to be fantastic in Courtney and company's hands. She's written many, many marvelous things, including Empiricist Devotions, Science, Religion, and Poetry in Early 18th Century England, which came out with Virginia in 2016. And she's written essays on rhyme, on language, and basically on all things poetic. She's also a fabulous and generous colleague, and in that capacity, she'll tell you about Anna and her work. And I'm going to now turn over to Courtney.
Thank you so much, Elaine. That's so kind. It's my true pleasure to be here today to introduce my friend, Anna Schwartz. She is an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and her new book, Unmoored, The Search for Sincerity in Colonial America, is just out from the Omohundro Institute for Early American History and Culture and the University of North Carolina Press. Her work has appeared in many other places, including New Literary History and Early American Literature, and has won prestigious awards, including the Norman Forster Prize for Best Essay published in American Literature and MLA's Richard Beale Davis Prize. You must get and read Unmoored. I'll drop a link in the chat after I am done here, for no summary that I could give here would do it justice. Among many other things, it taught me how to think about Anne Eaton in 17th century New Haven, a wealthy woman surrounded in her household by enslaved Indigenous and African people, a miserably unhappy woman who hated her husband, was prone to violence, and actively refused to do the thing that she was being told to do about her unhappiness. Talk about it. Anna puts pressure on the itchy, unpleasant feelings differently involved for everyone living in that settler household, while also suggesting that, as she put it, Eaton's silence is a gauntlet thrown at the feet of early modern promise, magnified on this frontier, that sincerity could purchase stability, happiness, and fulfillment. Unmoored begins with this anecdote through which Anna articulates some of her key arguments about how and why to historicize sincerity. But I begin with this because it's so quintessentially Anna. I have learned much from her, and this is how it often feels. She'll tell me about something historical I did not know, and then she'll talk about it in a way that makes me think differently and more richly about everything that I do know. I first met her years ago at a conference in the hotel breakfast room over sad oatmeal, and I sat spellbound as she told me why I should care about Thomas Jefferson's interest in poetic prosody. More recently, her current in-process pet obsession with the nopal or prickly pear and the little bugs associated with it that were used to make red dye has fundamentally changed my thinking about global racial capitalism. This description of Anna's work, though, doesn't capture the other thing that really stands out to me about it, its elegance, its graceful sentences, often with sparkling wit and humor to them. I can say sincerely that we're in for a treat of a talk. Anna Schwartz, The Long, Hopeless 18th Century.
Oh my God. Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Elaine. So my talk is called The Long, Hopeless 18th Century. There aren't that many jokes because the things people were hopeless about kind of sucked. In what follows, I'm just going to jump in. It's going to take me like 32 minutes and then we'll talk. Can you all hear me? Am I good? Cool. All right. So in what follows, I want to propose a shift in the mood of our research rather than make primarily a positive, like specific argument. I could get at that desired mood in a number of different ways. I could, for example, describe my autobiographical investments in early American studies or 18th century studies. Relatedly, I could offer personal anecdotes as analogical instruments, like look at these things I've experienced in order to see the past, in order to show you something about the past in the way that other people experienced it, only I really distrust my confidence that the ends and means won't switch place there. So I'm going to start, with an abstraction, 3 of them, Enlightenment, Reason, and Hope. We all basically agree by 2023, I think, we all basically agree that the Enlightenment was like, if not a bad thing entirely, like mostly bad than good, I think. Maybe we think it was bad entirely, I don't know. One of the worst things about it was that it claimed that there existed something like universal humanity, even as it built itself on deep injustice and inequality. I'm not that interested in relitigating this. I'm just saying we're all on the same page here and setting us up for our second abstraction, reason. We tend to operate with similar skepticism towards reason, at least insofar as an ideal of reason, like humanity universal, substantiated the Enlightenment's fantasies of itself, even as that form of reason monopolized, aggressively and with powerfully hushed disavowals, what we think thinking is. We tend to be less skeptical of hope, and relatedly, we tend to be less inclined to consider hope's role in the mood of what we want to claim is true. Hope suffuses the style of our scholarship. It is the wind in the sails of our claims to sincerity. Yet I think we underestimate first the degree to which historical individuals may often have felt hope to be eluding them. And second, we underestimate the increasingly narrow avenues they knew to pursue it. Let me try to say this more succinctly. We tend to under-notice the possibility that our historical protagonists, not despite, but because of their critical eyes, they often felt hopeless, that they often recognized or at least intuited that the social and political currents that we call enlightenment were accruing force and power because they advertised themselves as solutions to very bleak problems at the dawn of liberal modernity, problems that were very hard to imagine solving. I'm not going to claim that any single individual I discussed today actually was hopeless. That would be hard to prove, and at any rate, it kind of seems unfair to suggest that the moods of the past were any more permanent than the moods of the present. Instead, through surveying some central and some marginal individuals who were thinking, laboring, and living through the Enlightenment, I want to invite you all to take seriously the historical and personal significance of these moods, and in particular, the bleak mood that hopelessness names. A tiny bit of context before I jump in. My press would be disappointed in me if I didn't explain how this paper engages with and tries to advance the argument of my first book. The first book is called, sorry, I have to. Unmoored, The Search for Sincerity in Colonial America. The link is in the chat. It came out last month with the University of North Carolina Press and the Omaha Institute of Early American History and Culture. It costs like $32. If you don't really feel like shelling that out right now, I hope you will consider asking your library to purchase a copy. Anyway, in that book, I wanted to make 2 observations and 1 claim about sincerity. In that book, I observed that sincerity consists of 2 astoundingly ambitious ideas. First, the idea that we can reliably know ourselves. And second, the subsequently audacious expectation that what we say about that self should triumphantly matter to other people. From that observation, I propose that such a concept may, at the end of the day, be a deeply settler colonial inheritance. I wrote this book not primarily to criticize the earliest settlers of Anglo-America, the famously sincere Puritans. Curiously, it turns out one synonym for sincerity is purity of heart, an ideal you probably have occasionally claimed for yourself. I'm not going to lie and say that the desire to criticize those people was not there. More importantly, however, I wrote it because I felt and I often feel lonely and sad and wish that my friends, many of whom are professional readers and writers, I wish my friends knew better how to help me figure out why. That book, I hoped, takes seriously how difficult, as well as how ethically perilous and interminable, the work of self-knowledge and self-disclosure is. The second book, I'm tentatively calling it A Social History of the Soul, slows down with the history of the intensity of that desire for recognition, the longing, as a recent essay in J19 puts it, the longing to be seen. The challenge of being seen satisfyingly is a different way of understanding the ethical imperative in whatever it is we mean when we talk about the politics of representation. I think we think, sort of like casually and unthinkingly, that representation will answer the longing, both personal and political, to be witnessed and beheld. But from this angle, I think we gain a sense of the ongoing work it requires from the other side, as readers, critics, and witnesses, to recognize and stay alive to the rich nuances of other people's experience, their irreducibility to either caricature or history, the sort of singularity and irreducibility, to put it colloquially, like the moodiness that we claim obviously and intuitively for ourselves. So most of the tools we need to do this exist, I think, and they're not that far away. One of the most provocative theoretical instruments for me is Lauren Berlant's recent idea of inconvenience. I hope some of you have had the chance to read their last book on the inconvenience of other people. It's not mostly an 18th century book, so like no big deal if you haven't. It's also in terms of content, what it is about. It's like hard to read. It interests me though for the complication it poses to how this field over the past 8 to 17 years, how this field has metabolized Lisa Lowe's concept of intimacy. Lowe's book and the article that preceded it engaged with the 18th century enthusiastically. There, Lowe proposed the existence of subversive, extra-domestic, counter-liberal intimacies among individuals who had been deeply fucked over by the Enlightenment's ideas of reason, order, and progress. I'm mostly on board with Lowe's insights, but I'm also a little suspicious that we actually agree on what we're talking about when we use that word intimacy. I often get the sense that we think it's something that Brown or BIPOC people automatically and unthinkingly do when we encounter each other, which is both not true, and it's also more than vaguely patronizing. I would love it if I recognized intimacy with every Black and Brown person I met, but if it doesn't naturally happen, and it doesn't, despite my sincere desire, what now? One answer to that question is critique. And one such critique appears in Lauren Berlant's observation that alienation, like the possessive individualism against which we like to believe intimacy subversively triumphs, alienation isn't always experienced as separation from others. It is sometimes, but just as often, Berlant suggests, alienation expresses itself in the inability to participate agentially in negotiating the terms of your relationships with others. And that inability often feels like too muchness, like too much closeness. It feels like the too closeness of other people, and at times, the intuition that you yourself are infelicitously too close and too burdensome, in Berlant's words, too inconvenient, to those you hope will love you. It seems to me that if intimacy is our on-ramp to solidarity, the gas in the engine of the vehicle that's going to get us there is not simply repetitive claims that we are already there, that simply by existing in proximity to each other, we are tapping into something subversive. Rather, it seems like we need to start practicing being more sensitive to when and why others among us are failing to feel that, and maybe to strive better to understand the complex struggle some of us sometimes experience as estrangement from the hope that we ever will. So to walk us through hope's ambiguity, I'm going to start with a white guy who knew that you were not obliged to like him or even to listen to him, yet who put a little more effort than most men like him do to try to recruit you to like and to listen to him anyway. That white guy is not Karl Polanyi, it's Benjamin Franklin, but Polanyi distills the spirit of hopeful Franklinian earnestness and diligence when, in his 1944 account of capitalism's tumultuous development in 1780s Britain, the Great Transformation, Polanyi writes, "Hope, embodied in a concept of progress, expressed itself in a vision of perfectibility." Franklin famously wanted to use his life to vindicate the possibility of making that vision a reality. Polanyi's articulation of Franklin's dream has twofold value. First, it observes why people might have bought into liberal Enlightenment's promises that we, bought into liberal enlightenment and its promises, the promises that we in the more enlightened future are smart enough to know to be a ruse. The inhabitants of the 18th century longed for hope because they saw and often felt misery press around them. This is Polanyi. The vision of perfectibility was distilled out of the nightmare of population and wage laws, these laws that facilitated capitalism's enshrinement in state policy. Second, Polanyi notices how powerful that longing and its answer could be. That concept of progress was so inspiring that it appeared to justify, this is all a quote, very vast and painful dislocations. In dislocations, of course, we hear the movement of people across those famous 4 continents, and we are reminded of the violently naive utopianism of European reason. Aggressive naivete, of course, is one critique we might pose to Franklin's love of reason. But if we do that, we also have to acknowledge that Franklin already intuited Enlightenment reason's circularity himself. In one of his most charismatic moments of the autobiography, Franklin notices the sovereignty that individual reason sees fit to claim for itself. Hassled by his own commitments to like a vegetarian diet and to more foundational commitments to consistency before others, Franklin, fleeing family whose intimacy saddled him with undesirable obligations, Franklin had tried to shuffle off those inconveniences persuasively with a laugh, your laugh. Off the coast of Long Island, on his way to Philadelphia, Franklin and his fellow crew haul up some cod. Franklin, overwhelmed with the sensuous material world, his ravenous stomach, meeting the smell of frying fish, Franklin invokes reason to dissolve his former ideals, his commitments to them and to the people he'd inconvenienced in those commitments. The fish, he narrated with gleeful fake surprise, eat each other, and this licensed any other beings who noticed that inconsistency to treat them, the fish, likewise too, to eat them. This might have been sufficiently memorable a punchline, but Franklin's memory of the taste and mouthfeel and the satiety of the cod, it turned out, didn't retrospectively satisfy him, and he was hungry for something more. So he escalated the bit. Quote, and for those of you that like engage with Franklin, I'm sure you all know this quote, so convenient a thing it is to be a reasonable creature, Franklin reflected archly, since it enables one to find or to make a reason for everything one has a mind to do, end quote. Earlier in his autobiography, Franklin had appreciated and even proselytized vegetarianism for exactly that, for its convenience, and in turn, the hope of improvement it offered him and everyone he hoped to convert. A clearer mind, extra cash for books, and distance from less diligent family, friends, and coworkers. Here on the boat, however, he seems to have discovered, far off the coast of Rhode Island, reason's vertiginous supremacy. Anxiogenic, he tried to joke it off and to recruit you, smiling, to agree with him. What freaked him out, I think, was sovereign reason's loneliness, the Pyrrhic victory of having succeeded in using his mind to clear a mental path to pursue hope of happiness. Not simply the happiness of his stomach in that moment, but happiness in eluding the fact of his inconvenient dependence on other people. What's remarkable about the famous fish fry scene is how quiet, insular, depopulated, and painfully dislocated, to use Polanyi's vocabulary, it is. Franklin's joke is ultimately to readers, since the fish to whom he dramatically apostrophizes it cannot understand him. Even if they could recognize human speech, they can't hear it anyway because they're dead, some freshly, others not. But Franklin shared that boat with other people, the folks who caught the fish and fried it. He doesn't name it. Yet this episode seems to go to some small, he doesn't name them, yet the episode seems to go through some small trouble to minimize their presence. Franklin narrates the activity of others in the passive voice. When the fish were opened, smaller fish were taken out of their stomachs. Franklin didn't have to worry about missing other people if other people were not, at least narratively, there. Yet at this moment, leaving his home for the first time, it seems quite likely that despite, and maybe precisely because of his infelicitous relationships with his former intimates, he missed his home network a great deal. Of food and eating with others, he had written with some degree of fondness. Of 17 children his father had sired, he recalled in the first paragraph of his autobiography one instance of 13 sitting one time at his table. Of these 13, he was the youngest but 2. These dynamics would have been complicated and ambivalent, and this complexity and ambivalence was likely to have endured and echoed into his life as an adolescent and young adult. As the third youngest of a very large cohort of siblings, Franklin would have understood from his earliest conscious memories that recognition requires bending the self and its desires to the social conventions established prior to his existence, established by the people responsible for keeping him alive. And after several failed attempts to put him on the road to greater independence, Not total dependence, just less dependence, not total independence. His father apprenticed him locally to his older brother, James. This apprenticeship extended the domestic hierarchies into his daily execution of labor. Franklin knew he was often inconvenient to the people on whom he had no choice but to depend. The isolation of those cheap teenage vegetarian lunches was likely to have been a happy respite. There, he could encounter other personalities in books with markedly less coercive force. An experience of literature I'm sure will be familiar to many present. As with those lunches, the dislocation from a known home world was supposed to offer an escape from conditions that Franklin felt to be infelicitous to him, yet conditions of population and recompense, if not wage, that existed for reasons bigger and more complicated than he or anyone he knew could significantly change. The success of Franklin's joke about reason being able to justify any mental fancy assumed, though probably inaccurately and almost certainly with insufficient complexity, assumed that Franklin was pursuing a less inconvenient life in conditions he assented to. But those conditions consist of intimacies that were too intense, and relations that beset him too burdensomely, yet relations that he could not fix, no matter how many books he read during his sober lunch breaks. Better in his mind to exist apart and distant from them altogether. It offered him more rational hope for happiness, for a future less imperfect than the one he faced. Sometimes, of course, the discomfort of knowing yourself to be an inconvenience to people you depend on is superseded only by fear, material or psychic or both, fear of being cut off from those same individuals. Here is another Ben who knew that unhappy juncture well. In 1789, Richard Law, a perversely aptly named lawyer in the brand new state of Connecticut, received a letter about this second Ben. The letter does not indicate Ben's surname, in part because the letter wants to claim, first, that Ben's paternity is uncertain, and second, consequently, that Ben does not have a right to inconvenience the people among whom he lives. The lawyer reading about Ben is white. The people among whom Ben lives are Mohegan, and Ben, partially on his own admission, is Black. He thinks he is from Guinea partly. The man who is writing the letter is Samson Occam, or at least Occam is the first signatory, along with 4 other Mohegan men, Henry Quaquaquud, Robert Ashpo, Sam Ashpo, and John Supper. Occam's ambition in writing Richard Law was to secure the right to exclude Ben and better secure his hopes for Mohegan self-determination against white dispossession. In the eyes of white law, eyes to which Occam was always sensitive, Ben failed to count as Mohegan. Though his mother's people, the Mazines, were Mohegan, it wasn't possible, given Ben's dark skin, to claim the genealogical purity that, for white people's fantasies, legitimized territorial and political claims. And Ben's assertion of his own lineage suggests that he didn't wish to claim purity either. Yet Ben did not give up on claims to Mohegan identity. The existence of the letter implies this, and his persistence exposes at least one perspective from which hope may have felt significantly less accessible than the perspective from which Polanyi's protagonists act. Samson Occam had hope for his people's well-being. It affiliated him, at least provisionally and strategically here, with white settlers and the liberal laws they were building. Ben Mazine had hope too, but it would be just as tricky to pursue, maybe more. Ben's hope consisted in participation and membership in a polity that might be existentially threatened, or at least very significantly inconvenienced by including him. This is a very strange hope. It is not a clear hope for happiness in any unambiguous way. And though simple observation of Ben Mazine's uncomfortable position does not license modern critics to make definitive claims about the pessimism of his outlook, personality, or disposition, it does invite us to think sensitively and carefully about the textures of everyday life in Mohegan country as Ben Mazine and Samson Occam experienced it. Both men wanted to claim peoplehood and a safe place from white predation. Mazine wanted it badly enough to risk diminishing that same peoplehood and place. These aporios would have clung to their everyday activities like working, trading, gossiping, and worshiping. Ben Mazine probably sustained close contact with Occam, Quaquaquud, Supper, and the Ashpos on a regular, maybe daily basis. Some of these exchanges would have been awkward, some maybe weren't. Maybe some were resentful, others more mutually understanding. Ben Mazine may not have felt hopeless every day or even much of the time, but for him, there was little choice but to inconvenience the people on whom he depended, and this narrow opportunity for hope, as he looked to their shared political horizon, would have inflected the mood of his pursuit of satisfaction in day-to-day life. Horizons of hope is what Venture Smith, close neighbor to Ben Mazine and Samson Occam, longed for. And for Smith, indigeneity might have been an apt name for that horizon, and he came closest to saying so explicitly near the end of his autobiographical narrative, The Life and Adventures of Venture Smith, before his concluding Bleakness and Pessimism. There, this manumitted Black man reflected on the predations of white society, and he proposed that such injustice, a lifetime of predation, would have been branded highway robbery in his, quote, native land. Smith's phrase, native land, might not really signify that much for him, except for the fact that the anecdote it concludes explicitly thematizes the very frustrating inconveniences that white settlement posed for hopes of Black and Native felicity. Here is the anecdote. It's 1790. Smith and his grandson want to go to New London. Smith does not say why, nor does he say why he chose to hire an Indian pilot to get him there, despite observing only a few sentences earlier that he himself owned upwards of 20 boats, canoes, and sail vessels. The journey from Haddam Neck to New London is not short. During that time, Smith and the native pilot, probably a Mohegan or Pequot man, they may share navigation duties. They may take turns showing the grandchild familiar sights of the coastline of the Sound. Perhaps one or both teaches the grandchild how to catch fish, open them up with a knife, and fry them. Maybe they even tell jokes about the aquatic animals and their relations with each other. And even if they did not tell jokes, these men almost certainly talk during their significant voyage. And among their topics of conversation may have been the problem of Ben Mazine's membership, about which Occam had written law only the year before. Occam is a celebrity, both internationally and in that same region among those same waterways. So it's very likely that both men know him, if not know of him, if not know him personally. So maybe they talk about Ben Mazine. And if they did talk, they may talk also, or try to avoid talking about the mutual inconvenience that each man's pursuit of unhappiness's mitigation might pose to the other. On one hand, the native land that Smith had bought and began to deforest in Montauk, Pequot, and Mohegan territory. On the other, the rum and molasses distilled from Caribbean sugar, grown and harvested by Smith's literal and metonymic shipmates still in the West Indies, that is packed away in those barrels that this native man performs small jobs transporting. Both men are, at least indirectly, abstractly inconvenient to the other. And the native man becomes directly inconvenient to Smith when, docking at Saybrook on the return journey to deliver some molasses to Captain Elisha Hart, he fumbles one barrel, sinking 10 pounds of Hart's invested money. Hart responds by using the force of his access to litigation and coercing payment, but not out of the pilot, out of Smith, since the Indian being not able to pay for it. This is a quote. Smith insists intensely on the unfairness of this situation, and it makes sense that after narrating his conscription into someone else's drama after decades of trying to keep himself safe from white aggression, Smith's irritation would have reason to escalate into the ecclesiastical hopelessness of his conclusion. His hope of fairness existing somewhere, in his words, in his native land, suggests his recognition of the unhappy unfairness that his pilot knew in his own native land. It suggests maybe something like the intimacies across dislocation and deracination that Lowe wants us to see in these archives. Again, maybe. I don't think it's impossible that such intimacy exists here, but there are two things that I want us to see first. The first thing I want us to see in this era of fascination with absence and silences, the first thing should not be too challenging. The first thing I want us to see is the absence of an explicit will to solidarity, an absence of subversive feeling or evidence of intimate affection. Smith does not say that some sympathetic understanding of the native man's condition animated his payment of the cost of the sunk barrel. In fact, he goes to some lengths to insist that he was seeking any way he could not to pay for it, to avoid being inconvenienced by this pilot, or at least to be able to exert as much control over the terms according to which he was going to claim that debt. The second thing I want us to see is the unhappy consequences of presumed intimacy between the two men. It seems to be the reason that the white man conscripts Smith to paying that debt. Here, as Berlant suggests, is an experience of alienation expressing itself in the too muchness of proximity, an inability to satisfyingly exercise control over horizontal relationships. Franklin joked his way through loneliness. Smith, depressed, couldn't even finish his concluding sentence. Look, okay, I know. Ending on this note kind of sucks. A few blocks down the street are some infelicitous caricatures of an earlier generation of colonial literary study. They're wandering, and if I leave you like this, you might worry you'll run into them. We all know these caricatures have politically unhappy consequences, and it seems that our field has often responded to these caricatures' existence by trying to walk firmly in the other direction, to insist that those whom the Enlightenment inconvenienced the most innately understood the fact of that burden, understood its mechanisms, and innately saw, or more strangely, innately felt, solutions to these problems. Our arguments insist, with great hope, on the sureness of solidarity, intimacy, and the obvious desirability of being in community with others in incomparably unhappy circumstances. From the future, we know that capitalism, racism, and the possessive individualism that underwrites them are bad. We know that solidarity and coalition building across difference are good. And we know, because we are good students of John Winthrop's model of Christian charity, that unity across difference is made stronger and easier when we feel things for each other. So we look diligently and with hopeful urgency for any signs that these people felt things for each other. With Franklinian confidence in the power of good intentions, we seek to feel satisfied that we have found the feelings that we deduce were these people's best hope for surviving shitty conditions, even as we tend to underemphasize evidence of the many, many obstacles these individuals encountered to the unendingly difficult work of being there for each other within uneven, deeply individualizing and alienating conditions, and moreover, trying to be there in minimally coercive, maximally affirmative ways. I'm here for the spirit of optimism that existing scholarship preserves, and I think it's important not to give up in the face of bleak conditions. But I also worry about the cumulative effect of this critical optimism, disinclined as it is to linger with the abundant textual evidence of unhappiness, crankiness, itchiness, and resentment within and among the lives of individuals to whom we hope to do justice. I worry that that disinclination diminishes the reality, complexity, tumult, and ambiguity of these individuals' day-to-day struggles. In other words, I don't think we acknowledge their felt experience of hopelessness enough. Okay, so you can feel that this is the last paragraph, and you are right. How will we part? We might do worse than turning in our self-examination as readers and writers to the reader and writer with which I began, as well as the books he wrote, and maybe more interestingly, the books he read. Benjamin Franklin liked and was proud of liking books he thought would empower him in his hopes of a more rational and thereby more happy life. Some texts, like Locke's On Human Understanding or The Art of Thinking by the Messieurs du Port-Royal, were explicitly about how the mind worked. Others, like Dr. Mather's Essay to Do Good, were about how to direct the mind's working towards optimal activity. Others, like one by a guy named Tyron recommending a vegetable diet, suggested ways to guide the body to right action as well. Some, though, like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, were, as Jordan Stein has recently reminded us, a site of readerly identification and affirmation. And one of the compelling qualities of the Pilgrim's eponymous progress is how often during his journey he feels like he isn't making any progress at all. We recall that one of the first things that Pilgrim encounters on his journey to the celestial city is a swamp of despair, abandonment, and hopelessness. Any reader who got that far was simply encountering that vivid depiction a tiny bit less alone. And we can imagine one reader, Franklin, finding that representation dear. From the sometimes unpleasant too muchness of the print shop to the solitude of sober reading, here was an affirmation that sometimes things probably seemed discouraging. Things may even have felt hopeless, slow, sluggish, not worth the effort to rise back up into action. Of course, Franklin did rouse himself back up into action, and this is one of the most annoying things about him. Throughout the autobiography, he seems eager to represent himself as an inspiration, similarly to the way that many of us in our writing about the pilgrims whose progress through history we trace, likewise want to insist, inspirationally, that they really did make it to the land of Beulah. There is a time and place for all of these modes of writing. I will admit that the optimism usually feels tough for me to get behind, but it might just be the curse of my star sign rather than any real ethical substance that moves me to think with Kierkegaard that we all need to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. This approach, I would like to think, however, can be social and affirmative rather than simply bleak and individualistic. Like Franklin, when I read, I long for something more out of shared life, and sometimes in books I find it. Sometimes it's the fact of meeting new people on the book's pages. Sometimes it's in considering the local contours of their everyday worlds and the feelings of possibility, but also caution and recalibration that sometimes rise to the surface of these texts. These documents, like Smith's melancholy autobiography or Occam's vigilant attention to Ben Mazine, offer unblinking confrontations with challenges that no sensible person could claim were easy. My hope is, in witnessing those challenges with clear eyes, as well as witnessing the likelihood that they felt insurmountable, felt hopeless, we learn to make ourselves less inconvenient to others, more open to the possibility of being inconveniences ourselves. I think a good word for this hope maybe is intimacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Can everyone join me in giving Anna an applause, either virtual or you can clap whatever way you like. And I will open the floor now for questions. All the claps are confusing with the potential for questions.
See
We
what I
might
can.
need a moment or two to digest.
Take time.
Carrie, is that a question hand or a clapping hand?
It's an attempt, since people are still thinking. I don't really have a coherent question, but I really enjoyed that. Also because I'm fascinated with sincerity as a category and the self-scrutiny. And so I wonder, for me, the paradox about sincerity is that it can't ever be sincere, because the self-scrutiny behind it is predicated on trying to prove to oneself that you are in God's good graces, so that there's sort of a reward, even if you can't influence God as a Puritan. You're sort of, looking at, I'm just kind of drawing on people like John Newton, who writes these diaries and finds the evangelical tradition. So there's this tug away from sincerity. And then it seems to become, I love your, the bit in your book in the opening where you say it's one of modern colonialism's dearest accessories, sincerity. I love that in the opening of your book. But I just think it's also a weapon of power, in the sense of, judging other cultures as not having this high measure of self-scrutiny, and it's based on individualism as against collectivism, as you're talking about at the end. And so I just wondered, I suppose my question is the degree to which sincerity and sympathy are just completely incompatible, or work against each other. In fact, or maybe the same thing. I'm thinking of Lynn Festa, saying that sympathy is predicated on difference, on not being like other people, actually. So that, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that one aspect of sincerity that I wanted to spend some time thinking with other people about was it appears in something that Lauren Berlant says in the Optimism book, but it's like in the third or fourth chapter, so I think a lot of people maybe didn't get that far, I don't know, where they say there's an ideal of deep poetic interiority to which not everyone feels connected. And one of the things that I just I'm going to drive the car around the block a little bit while people think. One of the things that I disliked about the currency of the title of that book, Cruel Optimism, and about the that memorable cover image of a woman going like this, lying on the ground, is that an idea of cruel optimism has the effect of inflating one's own sense of poetic interiority, because one can imagine that by cruel, Berlant is pointing only to the shittiness of the good, the fakeness of the good life out there, and that the desires for the good life are say something pure about ourselves. I don't think that's what they mean. I just think that there's something about that phrase and that image that taps into something that I don't know if I include myself in that way, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't, that a lot of people feel, such that halfway through when we get to that line about do we all feel like a deep interior person? I don't know. And so I'm going to say something about sincerity, and then I'm going to try to draw this stuff about hopelessness back into it. I think one of the things that was really frustrating in reading scholarship about sort of like Puritans in New England, I don't even want to call them Puritans anymore, but like whatever, these settlers in New England, was that the scholarship finds it very hard not to take what they say. Like the scholarship is either like very like, you guys were bad faith actors and were killing everyone and you were evil on one hand, and no, but they really loved God on the other. And it was very hard to get those two, like it's like that never the twain shall meet. Like you're either in this camp or in this camp, and this camp is very big. And it seems to me that these two things can be reconciled. Like you can absolutely believe in God piously, sincerely, and do bad things. Like that is the reason God has such currency, as God says, I forgive you. Or we invented someone to say, I forgive you anyway. I think that I spent a whole book trying to do that, like that synthesis. And I think the thing that I want to think about next with hopelessness is the sort of, if deep interiority is like one legacy of settler sincerity, what hope is there for, like, I don't even want to say sympathetic success. I just want to like, what hope is there for like feeling okay with other people? If the person that you want to see you projects, without being a terrible person, without thinking about it, just kind of like thoughtlessly, keeps projecting their own vision of like a cruel optimist interiority onto you, and like actually no, I feel like chronically grumpy. It doesn't have to be like a deep story about like my soul. I'm just grumpy and I want you to see my grumpiness. Like I want hopelessness to just be like a placeholder for ways of feeling bad that don't necessarily turn on the narrative script that a lot of us have in our heads about how like the world is so unjust to me, everything is so cruel. Yes, the world is unjust. Absolutely, the world is totally unjust, but like it doesn't have to be a substitute for a personality. Sorry, I'm just like, wow, she's shitty. Thank you for that question, Carrie. I would love to know, if you don't have questions about these characters, we can just have like a collective group therapy where we talk about the things we are hopeless about. We could, maybe.
I'm gonna, while waiting for other hands to rise, I'm gonna have my little group therapy moment.
Yes.
I started my career at the United States Postal Service and spent 2 years working underneath a giant portrait of Ben Franklin and his turkey.
No.
No, I did. It kind of freaked me out because it was a really scary turkey. But one of the things, because I was doing a lot of reasons and ended up reading a lot of Ben Franklin and about Ben Franklin. But I was thinking, as you're speaking, about the anxiety of usefulness rather than belonging, and the kind of relationship between inconveniencing others and that intimacy and feeling useless as a kind of maybe a synonym or not a synonym for hopeless. And I was wondering if you could talk about uselessness or usefulness and hopelessness.
Sorry, I just can't write something in we could talk about that. Okay, uselessness. So I now see a door opening up to a section of this paper that I feel like I can now finish. So like, thank you for making explicit that word resonates with you, because I think one of the things that Franklin gets at like really well, like so well, I don't think he's aware of how good he gets at it, is something that I suspect many of us are living in the legacy of, which is a sense that participating in a community means justifying your existence among them by being a productive individual. We probably feel this to varying degrees depending on like the fit between our bodies and the people around us. I don't want to get too autobiographical about this, but like often like I feel not just at work, but in my like social and sometimes even like personal life, that if I am not useful to this person, they will abandon me. Like, I'm kind of exaggerating. This isn't therapy. It is when I realize that when I say that explicitly to myself, I'm like, that's horrible. Why do you think that? And then I ask myself non-rhetorically, why do you think that? And I think Ben Franklin is writing at this moment, like as like one of 13 kids, where his father wants to find him an apprenticeship, and like he probably feels more keenly than his older brother James, my family is tired of me, and I need to recompense them for all the work they're taking to take care of me. Like, maybe he doesn't feel that, but like his like manic humor suggests that there's something he doesn't want to say. That might not be it, but I think this is part of it. And I think maybe one synthetic way of putting this is hopelessness might be a good name for the bleakness we feel about the possibility of just being with other people without having to prove that we are worth it. Like worth it in like a super like quantitative way. Like, this is one of the things about Smith's autobiography that, like, again, if like those of us that have read Smith almost certainly remember, is like he counts everything. He counts all of the value that he invests in everything around him, including his family. Like, those children probably felt every now and then that they needed to vindicate that. Maybe not all the time, but thank you for that question. I'm like writing uselessness. I see a hand, David.
Yes. David, can you?
Hi there. So I apologies for arriving late, and that sounded like a really interesting talk. So thank you for that. I'm actually based in France, and I'm studying particularly Boswell and Sterne. So quite a lot of despair in there and hopelessness. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was whether you'd encountered the concept of despair being a sin, according to the church, and the kind of I suppose it's almost like a cycle or a circle, isn't it, where you start to feel desperate, and then you feel guilty, and then you feel even more desperate. I just wondered if these writers had actually touched on that at all.
Yeah, no, that's so the first book that I just finished is like mostly 17th century, and like very like most of the people I read about were like obsessed with thinking about things like despair, right? Like, for these Calvinists, like they have this whole morphology of like, if I feel this, then I feel this, and then if I go from feeling this to feeling this, maybe it's a sign that, like, God really has sent the Holy Spirit, and blah blah blah. And what was I'm going to observe something that I think is interesting there, and then I'm going to bring it back, forward 100 years or so. What I found, as many of us do, fascinating about the 17th century Calvinist context is the necessity of alighting like a little bird on despair in order to know, I recognize the depravity that the deity has saved me from, but you can't stay on that branch very long, right? Like, because that might be to, like, commit the unforgivable sin, to despair in the hope of ever being saved. I mean, it's a sort of very light touch dialectic. You have to know it, you have to see it, but you can't stay there because you might end up staying there too long. How can you control that? How could you possibly control that? Terrifying. I think by the time, if we like fast forward the VHS of history and we get to like the late 18th century, Franklin, I think, is a really, and I'm not the only one to observe this, Franklin is a really vivid figure for the, I don't want to say waning, but the transformation of that terror into a new social idiom, right? So like at the beginning of his text, he's like in Boston and he's like neighbors with like the Mathers, and like that that theology is like the sort of the air he breathes in his young life. And I think what fascinates me about the possibilities your question opens up is where that terror goes, given his optimism, that, you know, he feels like success in Philadelphia licenses him to advocate. Like this might just be like a fancy way of like restating Weber, but like adding Freud, right? Like the terror of knowing despair and having to keep despair fresh while not live in it. You know, I think we all agree intuitively there's something there that lends itself really nicely to capitalism. I think what I want to lean in and spend more time is like the capitalist mood of, you can hack your way out of this, that I think quietly, this is the last piece of my answer, I think it reemerges in many conversations that we have every single day, where we talk to someone about something that is bothering us and they immediately respond with, have you tried X? I feel like we both in that moment, but especially the person that says, have you tried X, really does not want to touch, like third rail does not want to touch. We are this close from despair because there are things in life that we might not be able to change, and like better to like live in deep disavowal or maybe denial than to like engage with that powerlessness like every single, like I'm exaggerating maybe. Does anyone else feel this? Thank you for that fantastic question, David.
Thank you. The answer.
Right, so we've had uselessness and hopelessness and despair. We got a rise on despair. James.
All right. Hello. Right, start video. Sorry, and I didn't get a chance to clap, but I wanted to, just couldn't figure out how to do Zoom, so I'm used to Teams. But no, I really enjoyed that talk, and I guess I wanted to ask about the what kind of the etymology of convenience, and I guess I was just sort of dimly remembering, like reading, you know, Foucault and the Order of Things, and it's sort of the idea of convenientia, like, you know, the sort of idea that the natural world is you know, sort of structured by all these sort of analogies or likenesses, and it seems to be that I suppose the older idea of convenience seems to kind of underwrite the I guess the newer developments, which is now the primary sense of convenience as something that's sort of easy. I mean, when often it comes with I guess a moral judgment about a certain complacency, which I think is there in Franklin's self-criticism. So I guess just my question was, I guess, about the relationship between I guess convenience as an analogy or likeness or fittingness and convenience as in this kind of more sort of moral sense. Sense, yeah.
What is this? I'm having this dawning moment where, like, so, I mean, the short version is like, holy shit, that's fantastic. I am gonna get off now and go reread The Order of Things.
Yeah.
Like in the way that, like, and this is now my circular anecdote, there was a moment like after I had finished like the indexing, like I could not touch the manuscript anymore for the first book, where like I rediscovered that Foucault writes about the Puritans in like the Heterotopias essay, and like I had not cited it, and like we all read that Heterotopias essay, and like I had completely just like erased it from my mind, and like I'm like, oh man, it sounds so stupid for not have citing the one Foucault that like one generation, everyone from a certain generation reads that Foucault. I'm having this moment of like, oh, you're right. He does talk about convenience in The Order of Things, and like any invitation to go back to Foucault feels like you know, a small party for me. Like Courtney knows this about me.
Oh, I guess it's so unfair. He's no longer named to conjure with, is he? But yeah.
Yeah, no.
I think it just seemed to be that there does seem to be some sort of underlying logic between convenience as lightness, because I think all of your talk is kind of putting pressure on. Well, the anecdotes turn on these kind of failed likenesses or something like that, I think, don't they? You know, but you know, I just thought, you know, it's just fantastic. I hope, you know, is it coming out on the? Do you have plans to publish this as a separate piece, or?
No, yeah. I mean, I'm going to say this out loud. If anyone in this room is affiliated, please plug your ears. I had hoped to have this finished by the end of 2022 and send it to ECS. You know, life gets in the way. I mean, I'm just going to say real quickly about inconvenience. Like, I don't think Berlant, in writing about inconvenience, does any sort of etymology, but like Berlant knows their Foucault. So like, there's something like, this is like a very rich opportunity, I think, for like, as I mean, I think this was your idiom, like putting a little bit of pressure on how Berlant uses that word, but then also like how Franklin uses that word, like that is there in his quote. And then, you know, in between the two, like,
Yeah.
Foucault.
Yeah,
Thank you
because
for that.
he makes a convenient judgment about the convenience of the analogy between himself and the fish. Like he's eating the fish, but the fish are also eating other fish, right? So yeah,
And like, we're all
that's right,
smiling
yeah.
at that anecdote. Like, it still works. It's like
Yeah.
embarrassing how good it works.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank
Anyway,
you. I'll let someone else do it.
thank you.
Our hour is officially over. So I would just ask you all to join me once again in thanking Anna so much for her wonderfully provocative and exciting paper. And just to put out a plea as well, if you or anyone you have encountered has something that they would like to present to ODSECS next year, I'm beginning to drop the slate for 23-24 annual year. So please do get in touch with me with any suggestions or recommendations. So thank you once again for your time. Thank you, Anna. That was a fantastic talk. And I look forward to seeing you all not next month because we're taking a little strike-based hiatus, but we'll be back in April and May and June. So thank you and good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you again.